Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is nowhere else in the world that I'd rather live right now.
Yeah.
You hear that feedback right across the northwest, west coast and King Island. It's not something that's said glibly. It's said with the deepest sense of conviction that I have seen. Tasmania is the best place in the world to live. We've all known that. But we want to aspire for something even better. Now, Mr. Speaker, COVID presented us with twin challenges, saving lives and saving livelihoods. It was at once a health and an economic crisis. So where we are as a state can be judged, I think, on those two measures. On 8 March 2022, in Tasmania, only 6 of 211 COVID hospital beds were utilised. 4 of 114 COVID ICU beds were utilised. The 347 ventilators in Tasmania, or more than 300 of them, have never been used for a COVID case. We have nearly 10 times the number of recovered cases that we know of in Tasmania than we have active cases. Our hospitals, to put it another way, Mr. Speaker, our managing and our people are doing well. On the economic side, we have the lowest unemployment rate recorded in Tasmania's history at 3.8%. Our economic growth, as measured through state final demand, is forecast to be an extraordinary 5.25%. We have the fastest wage growth in the country. That, in a nutshell, Mr. Speaker, is the state of our state. So how did we get here and where are we going? Well, in 2020, we were hit, as the world was, by a new and little understood coronavirus that originated in China. The Prime Minister closed the borders to our largest trading partners and then eventually the world. The Premier here, Peter Gutwein, closed our borders to our fellow Australians. In northwest Tasmania, we suffered one of the first major outbreaks in the country, and we were, as a state and as a government, rightly prepared to take unprecedented action. The outbreak in northwest Tasmania was jumped on immediately. The Army was called in. Thousands of families, some of whom I know well, were put into isolation. Sadly, 13 people died of the 223 cases. Since then, in Tasmania, our strategy has been clear and it has been strong.
You've infected
close the borders,
people.
keep society open.
Ms O'Connor, you know better than that.
Glide out of restrictions, get vaccinated and open up. Tasmanians stuck together and we toughed it out. Kids missed school, young couples, including Margot and I, cancelled weddings, our families missed funerals and births, businesses closed and workers were furloughed. That sacrifice, Mr. Speaker, we should never forget, was rightly seen as worthy and temporary. Tasmanians have done their part and the government is committed to doing ours. We are now living with COVID and our restrictions are coming off sensibly as part of that broader strategy of the glide path out of restrictions. You only need to look in the last few weeks, Mr. Speaker. Check-in Tas has been removed from most venues. We've removed restrictions now to all Tasmanians to travel and to socialise at venues, and masks are being removed in a sensible and staged approach. This strategy, Mr. Speaker, has bought us time. We're basically the least lockdown society on earth, with only 3 days in southern Tasmania in lockdown since April 2020. That is a staggering result. Others have endured 100 days of lockdown, followed by 80,000 people at the footy, followed by another 100 days of lockdown. Our strategy has worked, and we owe a lot to the conviction of the Premier Peter Gutwein and the sound wisdom of our public health advice. We've had the same number of deaths with and from COVID since we opened up as we did in those early days, but from over 50,000 cases. Each death, Mr. Speaker, in our society is worthy of mourning and remembrance. But it is important to know in public health that disease will always be with us, and the key challenge now is to manage and to target our resources to those vulnerable people who need them most. Some would like restrictions to remain in place indefinitely. going far beyond public health advice and with no mind to the unintended consequences which were born in 2020 but have no place in 2022. In our country, we have seen this impulse before. In 1949, Australia was groaning under the weight of a wartime Labor government which had decided to maintain wartime rationing and restrictions years after the military emergencies had passed. A resurgent opposition leader, Robert Menzies, head of the newly founded Liberal Party of Australia, said at that time, the Labor government misinterpreted the vote in 46 as an instruction, not to preserve the liberties of the subject, but to curtail them, not to encourage the restoration of normal competitive enterprise, but to set up a socialist state.
You're a disgrace.
Wise words from those times which echo through to now. Now, Mr Speaker, I wish to raise a couple of key trends and some key ideas about the state of our state and where we're going.
You're a eugenicist.
So the first is living with COVID. Now, there are those in this place who would have us maintain a state of emergency restrictions seemingly forever. But I ask Mr Speaker, what are the alternatives? Well, there are very few societies on earth who are maintaining a COVID zero strategy. Up until recently, they were Western Australia, New Zealand, China and North Korea. Well, in Western Australia, they opened up their borders on 5th of March. On the 4th of March, before they'd open up, they had 2,137 cases in that day and 10,000 active cases. In New Zealand, well, they had 32,674 cases on one day, the 28th of February. They currently have 192,000 active cases. That is a long way from the COVID zero strategy so fated by those who believe that we could keep it going forever. And China, well, we acknowledge that they're probably the only place in the world that is still continuing to try and pursue the policy of COVID zero in a world of Omicron. But the reality is, Mr Speaker, that the costs are now enormous and far out of proportion. Hong Kong's zero COVID strategy has completely failed with 300,000 active cases, and there was recently a month-long total lockdown, Mr Speaker, where people cannot even leave their homes for the basics in a rural village in China of about 13 million people. Now, Mr Speaker, those are our options if we are to try and pursue the restrictions forever. Now, we know in this place that there has been muddle-headedness from those opposite. Labor wanted us to open up our borders in June 2020, presumably to then face a world of lockdowns. But when it came time for one of the most vaccinated societies on earth to open up on 15 December 2021, Labor didn't seem to know whether they supported it or they opposed it, and so their policy was whinging and their platform was complaining. The Greens went even further. Mr Speaker, I charitably have thought of them as well-meaning but misguided, but quite frankly, the commentary in the last few months has been nothing but unhinged. Now, Mr Speaker,
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I take personal offence
you live in a glass house.
at Mr Ellis calling Dr Woodruff an epidemiologist and I unhinged. Could you please ask him to withdraw it immediately?
Mr Ellis.
I withdraw it, Mr Speaker.
Thank
Point
you.
of order.
On a point of order.
Draw your attention to Ms O'Connor referring to another member of this House as a eugenicist, and I ask that she be made to withdraw because that was actually offensive.
Sorry, you don't get to do that because I didn't call you one.
Mr Speaker.
No.
To Mr Ellis.
Well, Ms O'Connor, the issue within this House is showing respect for each other. I've asked the member to withdraw. You did that, and if you've done something that you shouldn't have done, I expect you to adhere to the standards that we expect of all our members. And so I didn't hear the comment, but I'm going back to the member now. He's making a contribution. The contribution on the state of the state should not have to be interrupted. You were heard in silence.
No,
I expect
wasn't.
the same.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. On the point of order, first of all, I wasn't heard in silence. Could you please seek some advice from the clerk under what standing order I should withdraw a statement that Mr Ellis didn't hear?
I didn't say you had to withdraw. I said I expect members to adhere to the standards of this place. Mr Ellis has the call.
And don't worry, Mr Speaker, some of us who have families who fled Eastern Europe under eugenicist regimes know quite rightly how offensive the comments from Ms O'Connor about this Liberal Democratic government trying to live with this virus and to equate that with eugenics is simply disgraceful. Now, if Ms O'Connor doesn't want to withdraw that, that is up to her.
On a point of order.
It's not just me, it's Women with Disabilities Australia and other disability advocates that
that's not a point of order, so I'll ask you to resume your seat.
You're exposed.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it says a lot.
Very much.
I think
very much so.
that those comments will remain on the public record and they will be a stain on Ms O'Connor's reputation for many, many years to come.
It's the truth.
Now, Mr Speaker, I want to move on to an aspirational Tasmania, a Tasmania where people aspire to live, because that is what we now see in the state of our state. Young people, Mr Speaker, are aspiring to move to Tasmania. When in our history can this be said? Sadly, Mr Speaker, the answer is far too frequently. In 2013, former Labor Minister Julian Amos wrote a famous piece called Tasmania, a State in Crisis, of the then Labor Green government. He said the recent round of economic statistics continue to highlight the fact that Tasmania's economy is in trouble. The high levels of unemployment, underemployment and the low participation rate emphasise the fact that for those who do seek employment, jobs are scarce. Things will have to change. A change in direction is badly needed. Well, Mr Speaker, a change came. It was a majority Tasmanian Liberal government that has delivered that change. And 8 years on from throwing out one of the worst governments in recorded history, we now see that Tasmania is a place where young people don't leave. It's a place where young people aspire to come. Because with a 3.8% unemployment rate, Mr Speaker, we can confidently say to young men and women right across Australia, Tasmania is a place of opportunity. It is a place where you can find a job, develop a career, have a family, buy a house and settle down. It's something that Margot and myself have done as young Tasmanians who were born in other places. It is an aspiration that we shared together, and we are very proud to be part of this movement of young people who aspire to be in Tasmania, to build a life here and to raise the next generation of Tasmanians. That is what jobs and opportunity provide to people, Mr Speaker. There are those who would seek to lock up the rest of our state and to take those jobs away. There would be those who would complain that a 3.8% unemployment rate is somehow not good enough, but when they were in government sitting on an unemployment rate above 8 or 9% and a state in recession, somehow that was okay. Mr Speaker, we should be very proud as a state of the work of businesses and workers to create the jobs and opportunities, to create the exports and the livelihoods that have powered opportunities for young people here in Tasmania and for new Tasmanians to come here, to call this place home and to build a life. Now, Mr Speaker, that is what the state of our state is in terms of aspiration in Tasmania. All Tasmanians should be very proud of that. Now, I want to talk about a few key ideas that are within the state delivered by the Premier today. The first is, and should always be, about jobs. Now, CommSec, through their State of the State reports, looks at 8 measures across our economy and comes to a similar conclusion time and time again. I think we have 8 in a row. Our economic performance is nation leading. There are those who would rubbish that report by saying that it's a comparison from 10 years ago. Well, Mr Speaker, I say bring on that comparison, because we all know who was in government 10 years ago. We had the lowest unemployment rate in history, as I mentioned, 3.8%, 259,100 people in employment. That is near a record, and Mr Speaker, our aspiration is to not just get through that record but to smash it. Importantly, despite a low unemployment rate, vacancies are 72.6% higher than the pandemic. There are countries around the world, Mr. Speaker, whose jobs have not even yet recovered to a 2019 level, and yet we have gone far beyond this. It indicates that strong employment conditions are continuing and that people who are seeking training and upskilling have things to look forward to in terms of jobs and opportunities when that training is done. We all know, Mr. Speaker, that these numbers don't just happen. They're not just a fluke, and particularly in Tasmania, because we so often lag the rest of the country. In this case, for one of the first times in our history, Mr. Speaker, we're not lagging, we are leaders. They are built on the back of strong economic leadership. We capitalised on renewed national supply chain and sovereignty capabilities. We're backing mining, including in the King Island tungsten mine, Mr. Speaker, where Tasmania has an enormous opportunity to play a part in one of the most critical supply chains of all. Because, Mr. Speaker, as the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression has taught us, the capacity for Australia and the Western Alliance to produce the critical minerals which go into just about everything in our society, but particularly our defence manufacturing, is not just a want to have, Mr. Speaker, it's a need to have. The King Island is one of the only places in Australia and, to be frank, in the entire Western Alliance where commercial quantities of tungsten are found. Now, after 30 years of closure, Mr. Speaker, I am very proud to say that I was there for the turning of the sod, for the redevelopment of that historic mine. And more than that, Mr. Speaker, it has been backed by extraordinary investment from this government, a $10 million loan to make sure that critical mineral capacity is developed right here in Tasmania, particularly because there is no global spot market, because 80% of tungsten is controlled by China, Mr. Speaker, as well as a $2 million upgrade for the electricity backbone infrastructure on King Island. And I was very pleased to be there with the Minister for Resources and Energy to launch that program. That mine will support the jobs on the island, opportunities for young people to become Tasmanians. But even more importantly than that, Mr. Speaker, tungsten is the hardest mineral in the world and is a critical component to our defence manufacturing. Whether it's armour plating or armour piercing, there is no alternative to the tungsten that will be produced on that island. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm very excited that there will be further defence manufacturing capabilities from those like Elphinstone and others in the northwest and across Tasmania to turn that tungsten into the kind of equipment that we're going to need in the 21st century when our world is sadly more chaotic, more uncertain and more dangerous. Mr. Speaker, there's also enormous opportunities in terms of us plugging into global supply chains and, in a way, disrupting them through the innovation that is the renewable hydrogen capacity of which Tasmania will be a world leader. Tasmania for a long time has been at the very end of a very complicated, nasty and messy global supply chain for liquid fuels. For the first time in our history, we have the capacity, through the developments of renewable hydrogen, to combine our renewable electricity resources and water to create the propulsion fuels that can power our cars, our buses, our boats, and so many more applications, Mr. Speaker, which are critical to our economy and currently rely on global supply chains coming from places like Russia and Iran, places, Mr. Speaker, that are no friends to Australia and certainly no lovers of peace. Mr. Speaker, our capacity to be able to develop hydrogen power on island in Tasmania has been backed by the government no end, and our exciting developments that are happening in Bell Bay and at Port Ladder in the northwest and other locations have not only the opportunity to be inputs in terms of our propulsion and in terms of our vehicles, but also in terms of our industrial manufacturing capability, Mr. Speaker, because we can replace so many of the fossil fuels of which we are a net importer with hydrogen, of which we hope to be one of the world's great economic leaders. In terms of forestry, we also know that Tasmania's future is bright and is strong under a majority Liberal government. We're the only party in this place who truly believes in the future of the timber industry that can grow in Tasmania. We've seen what's happened in the pandemic with global supply chains being disrupted, and timber is more in demand than ever. There will be a quadrupling of demand, in fact, Mr. Speaker, by 2050. The fact that Australia as a country is a net importer of timber is a shameful situation that has been brought about by Labor and Green governments around the country, and the actions of Labor governments in Victoria and Western Australia speak volumes of what they really think about the timber industry. But we'll continue to back them, Mr. Speaker, because Tasmania is a heck of a good place to grow timber, and it's a huge part of our contribution to Australia's supply chain. It goes into the homes, it goes into the buildings that keep Australia going and keep providing jobs and opportunities. I also want to talk briefly, Mr. Speaker, about our ports, which are being upgraded with some historic investment in the northwest, as well as our new spirits. Now, it's a shame. Dr. Broad is still in the chamber, and I remember less than a year ago him talking about what a terrible shame it was that our spirit capacity and the capacity on our boats across Bass Strait were full. Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that's a really good sign, because this government is a government that believes in increasing our exports, growing our jobs, growing our population. And the increased capacity that goes on our shipping lines across Bass Strait is a sign of all those things. Compare that to a strategy of population decline, of job destruction, of empty boats. Mr. Speaker, we can be very proud of where we're at, and that's why we're investing in 2 new spirits. It was very heartening to see last week the cutting of new steel that will go into those historic investments, $700 million to power the northwest coast economy. We all know of the decline and the decay that was wrought by the opposition on that
Member
matter.
for Braddon, order.
So, Mr. Speaker, I'm really proud that this government is investing.
Member for Braddon, you'll be asked to leave. I just asked you to come to order, and you continually kept interjecting, so be very careful.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is no surprise that from them we get nothing.
Same goes to you, Member for Lyons.
We get nothing but complaining when we increase our capacity and we create more jobs. It says more about them than it does the aspirations of the Tasmanian people, Mr. Speaker, I can assure you. We're seeing massive upgrades in the ports of Devonport as well as the port of Burnie. They are our 2 largest container ports by a country mile, Mr. Speaker, and they are critical in terms of the economic future of the northwest, but also Tasmania as a whole. These historic investments will support civil construction for years to come, Mr. Speaker, but even more than that, will create the capacity that our growing state needs to continue to provide the jobs and opportunities that young people need to see, so that they can have the confidence to stay in Tasmania, to grow a family and to build a life. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak briefly about training because as a tradie, it was the thing that set me up in life, and I know you as well, Mr. Speaker, as a motor mechanic and a TAFE trainer, know this more than just about anyone. An apprenticeship is the key to unlock a decent life for so many people right across our economy, Mr. Speaker. The Premier said in his State of the State that the passage of the TASTAFE Bill 2021 through the Parliament in November will put TASTAFE as our public provider of vocational education and training in a stronger position to meet the demands of the future and make sure that every Tasmanian has the best opportunity to get the skills that they need to get a job. Mr. Speaker, I could not agree more. There are enormous opportunities for us to change the Tasmanian training regime here in our state by allowing more flexibility in terms of the people that we can bring on as TAFE trainers, by providing more industry-led, more industry-focused training for young people, so that when they leave TAFE, they've got the skills to continue to slot into their employers and to improve even the things that they do by making sure that training in Tasmania is innovative. Now, we know Labor shamefully oppose that because they are holeless bowlers, captors of the union movement, who sadly have seen it fit to oppose and delay what is one of the most necessary and important reforms to training and education in this state in our history, Mr. Speaker. We have huge opportunities just waiting for young people who can get the training that they need to take on Mr. Speaker, the capacity to get a pay rise, to get a new job, and to get an opportunity comes from fantastic training, and that is what we're building in this state and opposed by those opposite. Mr. Speaker, we want to provide a high-vis army, providing $1 million to both the Master Builders Tasmania and the Civil Contractors Federation each year over 4 years to attract more workers to the industry and improve skills development. Because I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, you want to be in the construction industry right now. It's a phenomenal place to work at any time, but right now with things going flat out, there is more overtime than you'll know what to do with. You'll be able to save up a deposit for that house. You'll be able to buy that engagement ring, and you'll have the opportunities that you are looking for in one of the most exciting industries in the world. There is nothing more satisfying, Mr. Speaker, that as every child of a tradesman will tell you, of driving around the streets of where you live and being able to point out that you built that you're looking after that place, and to have the respect of people who know that you've got their best interests at heart. That's why we've also moved in terms of extending our payroll tax incentive scheme to make sure that employers who want to take on apprentices and trainees are not slugged with that tax. It gives them an opportunity for 2 years in the case of trainees and apprenticeships, and 1 year for young people 15 to 24 to remove that barrier and increase the incentive to take on those people and to train the next generation. And that leads, Mr. Speaker, into home ownership. And this is one of the key aspirations of young people, and I'm so proud that the Tasmanian Government has made the bold call to support the housing market entry scheme, which will mean that one of the biggest barriers for young people, which is saving up that deposit, will be significantly cut back. Now you only need 2% to get into your own home. There's a state equity contribution of $200,000. We want to get young people off the rental roundabout, Mr. Speaker, because then that can set them up for the next part of their journey. We want to support them, not keep them in a state of needing to rent when they could pay the mortgage on their house if only they could get the deposit that they need. It's about backing aspiration. It's about backing our young people and saying to people right across Tasmania that if you want to own your first home, if you aspire to that, then we'll be there with you every step of the way. We're also opening up this for first home buyers who would otherwise be unable to obtain finance, to enable them to purchase existing homes rather than to have to build a home of their own. Mr. Speaker, there's a reason why this is really important, because a lot of young people, and we did the same, want to buy the worst house in the best street, work bloody hard to do it up, and to have that family home in which you were able to put the time and energy into making that a place to call home. So if we have the support for young people to buy existing homes, they can put their energies into urban renewal and transforming our streets in a way that will support the construction industry and support these neighbourhoods that want young people to become a part of their social fabric and not just incentivising people purely to build new homes. Mr. Speaker, getting a decent job and owning your own home is the foundation to so much that is good about family life. And that's why this Liberal government supports that, and we want to see more young people on that journey. Mr. Speaker, government customer service is something that I'm particularly excited about in my new role as Parliamentary Secretary to the Premier, and we will be seeing a lot more, Mr. Speaker, about the way that we provide customer service to our people. In the budget, Service Tasmania's digital portal is an initiative that will begin the development of a digital Service Tasmania to provide Tasmanians with a secure and easy access point for government services, access through a single login. This portal will provide anywhere, anytime, any device access to government services through an accessible and user-friendly interface. Mr. Speaker, this is an exciting opportunity. Tasmania was right at the forefront of government service delivery in 1998 when we set up Service Tas, and we have an opportunity to take that to the next level. We're fantastic at in-person services with some of the most friendly, caring and wonderful people that you'll ever hope to meet, and over the phone as well. And we want to bring that to digital so that they can take it up in the 21st century. Mr. Speaker, Menzies said in 1949 that this is our great year of decision. Are we for a socialist state with the subordination of the individual to the universal officialdom of government? Or are we for the ancient British faith that governments are the servants of the people, a faith which has given fire and quality and direction to the whole of our history for 600 years? Mr. Speaker, this is our moment for decision, where we go forward, where we live with COVID, where we continue to prosper, and as a state, that we take the tough decisions to get back to normal.
Members' time. Honourable Premier.
Here.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to sum up the State of the State address. Could I just say that once again, I couldn't help but think that coming in last after Mr. Ellis, it's a hard act to follow. Very well done. And at the first point that I wanted to make on this side of the House, just in terms of the contributions that I've heard over the last week and a half in terms of the state of the state, is that those contributions were aspirational, that they come from people that come from a wide range of backgrounds. We've got nurses, plumbers, teachers, we've got farmers, we've got lawyers, Mr. Speaker. We have small business people, managers from the not-for-profit centre, Mr. Speaker. We have a wide representative group on our team, and importantly, Mr. Speaker, they are here because they all got into this business because they aspire for something more for the people that they represent, Mr. Speaker. And I don't think that there could be anything more stark between this side of the House and that side of the House. And one of the contributions that I heard, I think it was last week, Mr. Speaker, where the member for Bass, Ms Finlay, said that she had to look up the word aspirational to understand what it meant, Mr. Speaker.
That says it all.
Had to look that word up, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker,
completely different
Mr. Speaker, we want more. We want better for the people that we represent, Mr. Speaker. And we make no qualms about that, Mr. Speaker. We want to see this place do better and the people that live here do better. And I think in terms of the contributions that we've heard today from Mr. Tucker, Mr. Ellis, yesterday from Lara Alexander, I think that demonstrates the depth of quality, the depth of person, their desire to see this place do better. And I must admit, I was touched by Ms Alexander's speech yesterday when she spoke of living in Romania and the desire to get out from under the yoke of an oppressive communist regime. And she made the point about her own father. Her own father, Mr. Speaker, as a university student, being interrogated, persecuted for the crime of having a book that wasn't approved. I think it was Gone with the Wind you mentioned yesterday. You know, what a dreadful crime that is for a university student to have a book that's not approved, and what a terribly subversive political doctrine Gone with the Wind is, Mr. Speaker. But to hear Ms Alexander's story, I think spoke volumes for the reasons that she is here in this place. The fact that she wants to see better outcomes, wants to see the opportunity for people to live with freedom, Mr. Speaker, and to reach their full potential, Mr. Speaker. And also made the point yesterday that she's noted that this government will work with community organisations, not-for-profits, Mr. Speaker, the business sector, because the best way that we can move things forward is if we work together to move things forward, Mr. Speaker. And so I have to, though, with some disappointment, reflect on what has occurred on the other side of the House, Mr. Speaker. I don't think that there has, in my time in politics, ever been a more negative state of the state response from a leader of the opposition. That did not provide one policy option, did not provide one initiative, Mr. Speaker. And again, and I'd make the point, I would make the point that over the years we have offset on this side of the House, and I know from my time in opposition how important this is. that you need to bring down an alternative budget. You need to point to the things that you're going to do, and importantly, you need to have to explain how you're going to pay for them.
That's right.
And what was clearly evident, both in their budget response, Mr. Speaker, last year, and again in the State of the State response from those on the other side, Mr. Speaker, what was patently obvious is that they stand for nothing, Mr. Speaker. They stand for nothing, and they've had their opportunity now over a week and a half to actually place on the public record what Labor stands for in this state, Mr. Speaker, and again they have failed miserably. Now, in terms of the State of the State, Mr. Speaker, it was an aspirational speech, but what it did do, Mr. Speaker, in terms of those aspirations, was it explained what we want to do in health, what we want to do in housing, what we want to do, Mr. Speaker, in terms of our aspirations to put Tasmania on the national stage, and importantly, the steps that we are taking. And also, Mr. Speaker, I took the opportunity to update the House in terms of where we are in terms of COVID. Now, for 2 years, we have had the best response, Mr. Speaker, the best response since March of 2020 through to March of 2022, the best response out of any jurisdiction in this country. There can be no doubt at all about that, Mr. Speaker. We have managed our borders sensibly. Right. We've outlined a sensible transition plan, Mr. Speaker, to living with COVID. And importantly, when we needed to take those tough decisions, to step away from what other states and territories were doing, to step away from the national plan, Mr. Speaker, we did so if it was in the best interests of Tasmanians. We made decisions that were right for the people here. Right. And as we've stepped through since December 15, Mr. Speaker, albeit there are some in this chamber that have provided some of the most negative commentary that I have ever seen, some of the most frightening commentary that I've ever seen, Mr. Speaker. What this side has done is we have stayed true and steadfast to the advice from Public Health, Mr. Speaker, and we have stepped every single step of the way through the plan supported by Public Health, Mr. Speaker. And as I've said in this chamber on a number of occasions, we haven't dislocated from them as other premiers and First Ministers did. We haven't held press conferences where, as a government, we wanted to speak about things that Public Health didn't support. We have stayed with them. Now, that has been difficult at times because there are some, Mr. Speaker, across the community that would have liked us to move faster. There are some, Mr. Speaker, that would have liked us to move slower. What we did is we took every step of the way in tandem with Public Health, Mr. Speaker, and every step that we've taken has been informed by Public Health. Right. Now, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the speech that I delivered last week, I made the point that our state is not only one of the safest places on the planet, but also it has an economy that is very strong. Who would have thought in this state, and certainly not me growing up, that we would get to a point where we would have a 3.8% unemployment rate, Mr. Speaker. Yeah, right. Record levels of employment in Tasmania. And what that means, Mr. Speaker, as I know that those on my side of the House understand, it means opportunity, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. It means that those in our community that want to be aspirational, want to reach for more, Mr. Speaker, are able to do so. And getting that job, Mr. Speaker, is the first step for them. But we are in an extraordinarily advantageous position at the moment, Mr. Speaker. We are viewed as being globally unique. We have what the rest of the country wants. We have what the rest of the world wants, Mr. Speaker. And importantly, this moment we intend to grasp. We intend to grasp, Mr. Speaker. In terms of jobs, and it makes me very pleased and proud that in terms of job opportunities in Tasmania, that we are 72% higher in terms of the growth in job vacancies than what we were before the pandemic. 72% higher, Mr. Speaker. That means right now, no matter who you are or where you live or your circumstance or background, that if you want to put your hand up for a job, Mr. Speaker, there are jobs available in our economy. And importantly, I pointed last week in terms of the training and skills that we want to provide and the way that we've established TasTAFE now. Mr. Ellis spoke about it briefly a moment ago in terms of ensuring that TasTAFE can operate more like the businesses that it's there to support, Mr. Speaker. Opposed by Labor, but we want TasTAFE to be nimble, Mr. Speaker. We want it to be responsive. responsive. We want it to be able to provide the training and the support that is necessary to enable Tasmanians, regardless of who they are, as I've said, to enable them to get the opportunities to be trained and skilled so that they can grasp those jobs, Mr Speaker, in our very fast-growing economy. Mr Speaker, I've often made the point that we came into the pandemic with one of the strongest balance sheets in the nation. In fact, the strongest balance sheet in the nation. We carried no debt, Mr Speaker, no net debt in terms of our balance sheet position. We had cash and investments, Mr Speaker. And so when we needed to move, Mr Speaker, when we needed to provide unparalleled, never before seen levels of financial and social support, we were able to. And we provided, Mr Speaker, on a per capita basis, the largest level of social and economic support out of all of the jurisdictions across the country, Mr Speaker, because we had the capacity to do so. And we will come out of this. Thanks to Labor. We will come out of this, Mr Speaker, with the lowest level of net debt on a per capita basis out of all of the jurisdictions across the country, Mr Speaker, and a manageable level of net debt, Mr Speaker. And importantly, what has happened over the last 2 years, because we instilled confidence in our community, we instilled confidence into our business sector and our investors, Mr Speaker, is that they continued to spend, they continued to invest, and importantly, as I've said, a 3.8% unemployment rate, Mr Speaker, unheard of in Tasmania, because what we were able to do as a government was to ensure that our community was confident. They were safe, they were confident, and they could get on with their lives, Mr Speaker. And what we're finding in terms of our transition plan to living with COVID, that continues to occur. Mr Speaker, the revised estimates report, which we released recently, Mr Speaker, indicates that our financial position is coming back, Mr Speaker. We had an improvement in our bottom line in terms of our net operating balance, Mr Speaker. We're seeing strong growth in our revenues as we move forward, largely because of the confidence in our economy, Mr Speaker, the fact that people are continuing to invest, Mr Speaker, and importantly, Mr Speaker, that is going to continue. What Treasury have forecast is strong economic growth, Mr Speaker, not just next year but over the forward estimates as we move forward. And they revised upwards state final demand from 3.75% in the budget to 5.25% this year, Mr Speaker. And we know that last year we had one of the strongest growing economies in the country in a state final demand sense, Mr Speaker. The outcome has been extraordinary for this state, and I'm so very thankful that Tasmanians have worked with us as we worked our way through this, Mr Speaker. Now, in terms of other matters that I spoke about last week, in respect of health, it is important that we move outside of the 4-year electoral cycle and that we provide long-term vision in regards to health. And that is why, Mr Speaker, that is why we've announced a 10-year plan for health, Mr Speaker. And importantly, Mr Speaker, in terms of the LGH and the master plan there, Mr Speaker, which is on foot, as I understand it, Mr Speaker, and the implementation plan will be provided soon, Mr Speaker, in terms of that 10-year master plan. It's that type of vision, Mr Speaker, so that Tasmanians and our constituents can understand where we're going, but importantly, it enables us to plan. It enables us to lay down the investments that we're going to make. It enables us the opportunity to speak to the Commonwealth Government or other levels of government and talk to them about what their contribution should be as we work to improve the outcomes for our community, Mr Speaker. And in terms of health, I noted a question this morning from the opposition, and I thought, that demonstrates the lack of vision. That demonstrates the navel gazing that is occurring, Mr Speaker. And right through this, Mr Speaker, we have found that the opposition have done their very best to frustrate, to be negative. It's interesting in terms of the question that was asked this morning in respect of how we're going with the second crossing of the Tamar. The point that I should have made this morning, and one that I had forgotten, was that they don't even want it.
They opposed it.
They opposed it in the election, Mr Speaker. They opposed it. They had some wondering how it's going, but at the end of the day, they said they wouldn't support it anyway. I think that says it all, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker. Now, in terms of housing and the $1.5 billion plan that we spoke about last week, The establishment of Housing Tasmania as a statutory authority, one that has its own balance sheet, a balance sheet that will be greater than $2 billion, Mr Speaker, when established, that provides the opportunity to invest and to borrow, Mr Speaker, but importantly provides for a target of 10,000 social and affordable homes by 2032, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, a bold target, but one that we have to aim for and importantly one that we need to achieve, Mr Speaker. And in making that restructure, I'm certain the other side of the House, like they did with TasTAFE, will more than likely oppose this. But we are going to get on with it, Mr Speaker, because we believe that we need to do more, because who would have thought 2 years ago at the beginning of a pandemic that 2 years later, as a result of the management of the pandemic, both in this country and in this state, that what we would see is record house prices, that we would see asset values increasing. Mr Speaker, what was forecast was economic destruction. What was forecast was the banks withdrawing from the market. What was forecast, Mr Speaker, was recession. But what we've seen is exactly the opposite of that. And so this challenge that we have now, Mr Speaker, where we have a strong growing economy and strong growing property prices, Mr Speaker, means that the government needs to do more. It needs to rethink the way it's going about things. And that's why we have introduced the Housing Market Entry Program. Mr Speaker, we need to give more young Tasmanians, more Tasmanians that haven't purchased a home, the opportunity to get their first step onto the property ladder, Mr Speaker. And the Housing Market Entry Program, which will replace Home Share, is exactly the program that will do that. And I announced in the State of the State that will provide up to $50 million worth of equity, Mr Speaker, to ensure that we can supercharge that program moving forward. And what it will do, it will provide for, if you're building a home and you meet the assets and income test, it will provide for up to $200,000 worth of equity from the government, or 40% of the value of the property, Mr Speaker. If you're building a home, if you're purchasing a home, up to 30% equity, or up to $150,000. But the point I'd make is I think that the income test, Mr Speaker, for many people will be quite an achievable test to meet. Around $82,000, I think, for a single person, and $114,000 for a married couple or a couple with one child, and they will meet the income test. And then as long as your assets, as per the current home share arrangements, aren't more than $100,000 in terms of financial assets or cash, then you can meet those tests. And importantly, Mr Speaker, we can help you get that first foot onto the property ladder. Now, larger states certainly have the budget capacity to do this type of thing. But I think it's because of our scale and the way that we'll be able to engage in the marketplace, Mr Speaker, that we can be a nation leader in terms of how this program works. And so that program, in concert with Housing Tasmania, being established and having a target of 10,000 homes, Mr Speaker, by 2032 is going to change the housing market in this state. And importantly, what we're going to see as well with that investment is that the programs that we've run over the last couple of years have brought forward a lot of housing spend. We've got people now that are in the market building houses that might have been going to wait for a couple of more years, but the support from the federal government, the support from the state government that was provided has brought that forward. It'll mean that as the market starts to settle, the homes that we're going to build will fill that gap, Mr Speaker. That's right. And what that will mean is that we'll keep tradies employed, that will continue to provide apprenticeships and traineeships, Mr Speaker, and that our economy will remain strong moving forward.
Liberal government.
Now, Mr Speaker, in terms of other aspects that I spoke about in the speech, I've touched on our plan for health. And I think it's an important point to make before I step away from that, that since the middle of last year, we have invested significantly in health from a COVID response, but also since 2014 we've invested very strongly with one of the longest serving health ministers sitting right here, Minister Ferguson. We started a pathway to where we've now put on more than 1,500 FTEs into health. There's never been growth in terms of the professionals and staff that are working within our health system like there has been under this government. If you look at a hospital the size of, say, the Mersey, that has a staff, I understand, of around 700 FTE. We have put on in the last period, since we came to government in 2014, the equivalent staff to fund, or the staff, 2 hospitals of that size. We have invested and we will continue to invest, and importantly, with 10-year plans in front of us in terms of the capital investment that we're going to be making in the LGH, the Royal Hobart Hospital, up on the northwest coast in terms of the northwest regional, and also the Mersey, Mr Speaker, we will ensure that our health infrastructure is fit for purpose. I've spoken about housing, Mr Speaker, and the fantastic opportunities are in front of us there, and I hope that the other side of this Parliament will support the steps that we're going to take to ensure that we can establish Housing Tasmania as a statutory authority, Mr Speaker, and provide it with that opportunity to invest more, Mr Speaker, to develop more, Mr Speaker, to meet the aim of 10,000 new homes, Mr Speaker, by 2032. Importantly, I want to talk about the opportunity that we have on the national stage. Now, in terms of the discussion today, in fact, that's going ahead, I understand, at AFL House with AFL presidents, Mr Speaker. We are on the cusp of having our own AFL team. It'll take, I think, until July or August before we get to the final decision point. But this has been a 30-year journey for this state, and I believe that Tasmania, as a state of the Federation, should have a team in the National League, should have a team on the national stage, Mr Speaker, because as I've often said, what sporting clubs are about they're about aspiration. They aspire, Mr Speaker, to win games. They aspire to win flags. But their strongest aspiration, their most important aspiration, is that they want to see the young men and women that come through those clubs have better and more fulfilled lives when they leave. We want to see Tasmanians, young men and women, boys and girls, have better and more fulfilled lives as well. And right now, Mr Speaker, in terms of the national stage, you have to leave Tasmania if you want to play on it, Mr Speaker. And so, unashamedly, we will continue to push for an AFL licence, and importantly, to provide this state with an entertainment and sporting venue, as we described last week, Mr Speaker. Down at Regatta Point, the opportunity to ensure that we've got a roof stadium that will ensure that not only can we play AFL, but importantly we can play A-League, we can have entertainment events, Mr Speaker, of up to 30,000 people in a covered stadium. We get the opportunity to see the first landing point in this country of those major acts and international artists, which now only tour the eastern seaboard and possibly across to Perth. Mr Speaker, Tasmania will be in a position where those sorts of events can land here, Mr Speaker. And we will continue to push. And importantly, a long-term plan for health, Mr Speaker, a long-term plan for housing, Mr Speaker. We've got some of the greatest and highest levels of investment into education, Mr Speaker, and we have made significant change there in terms of 11 and 12 as well. Mr Speaker, this state has an opportunity, has a moment in front of it. And when you consider the wealth of opportunities that we have, and they've been spoken about this morning in terms of renewable energy, the fact that 100 years' worth of investment provides us with the opportunity to grasp a moment that's never been seen before, Mr Speaker, I think very clearly that Tasmania's best days are still in front of it, Mr Speaker. And so, in closing the debate today, Mr Speaker, I do want to say once again how disappointed it was to hear some of the contributions from the other side of the Parliament, Mr Speaker. The negativity, Mr Speaker, in fact the relentless negativity that occurred. The fact that in the contributions that were made, that we saw from the Leader of the Opposition, not one sensible policy option, not one new initiative announced, Mr Speaker, in what was, I think, a 40-minute speech. It's very easy, Mr Speaker, to be negative. It's very easy to talk down the state, Mr Speaker. And what I think is occurring on that side of the House is that it is now permeating from the Leader of the Opposition down through each and every member that sits with her. because together, Mr Speaker, they have not been able to put together a cogent plan for the state. They haven't been prepared to put together a range of initiatives that will improve the lives of Tasmanians, and they certainly, Mr Speaker, don't understand what aspiration means, because one of their members had to look it up. Mr Speaker. On this side of the House, we unashamedly back Tasmania, Mr Speaker. We unashamedly back investment in Tasmania. We unashamedly, Mr Speaker, back jobs in Tasmania. And we will continue to be, Mr Speaker, aspirational, because we believe that Tasmania, as good as it is now, can still get better, Mr Speaker. And we want to ensure that this moment that we have, that it's not missed,